Good morning, Chris Lloyd. I'm a principal architect with Oxford Computer Group. Today we're going to look at some scenarios around identity and access in higher education that we've seen through multiple projects with our clients in the higher education space. This is primarily focused on the effective management of multiple role users, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But just to do some quick housekeeping first here. Just to outline the agenda of today, we're going to be looking at an overview of multi-role users. That's a mouthful. And looking at some of the solutions about automating the identity lifecycle. And then as a bonus content, I always like to kind of go back to something security related around identities. And today I'm going to be picking on some password things and what we can be doing to strengthen passwords and maybe even get to a password-less authentication, at least starting to move in that direction. Probably going to be around 45 minutes. It might be a little bit shorter. It depends on how quickly I go through all this stuff. If you want to, you can submit questions, via the GoToWebinar chat client. I'll be monitoring those. If I miss them, I'll try to wrap through them at the end so I can keep up. And we're recording this, and we can send you a link to the recording when it's posted. And just a little bit about OCG. We've been in the identity industry here for about 15 years. We do identity management, identity governance, device management, security, and much more. We're a very strong Microsoft partner, as well as other partnerships with Savient and Lieberman, which is now Baumgar. But we have a very deep track record with the Microsoft team. And we've been a partner for several years, as well as partner of the year for many years as well. So kicking this off, multi-role users, who are they? These are users who usually exist in an environment, and they have distinct roles in that environment. Unlike contractors and employees or contingent workers and employees, those users usually exist in a binary state. Where you have, user is a contractor. They cannot be a contractor and an employee. These are users who exist where they are two things or more things at the same time. And in higher education, we see that as they are a faculty member or basically an employee of a university and also a student. That's probably the most common use case that we run across. What that means is that there's going to be usually two distinct levels of access, and that even usually reflects in multiple accounts. So a lot of times we see where a faculty member has a distinct AD account for a faculty member, and then they have an AD account for a student, and as well as ancillary accounts for different applications beyond that. And there's a reason why they're broken up that way for they're accessing different things that require a specific account. And it really usually comes down to the applications themselves. Sometimes we do get them down into a single account, but oftentimes those two accounts need to be distinctly managed and identified. And just to start off here to know, how many of you have seen this use case, I'm just going to do a quick poll. And does your organization have multi-role users in it? I'm expecting a lot of people to say yes. Some may say no, but a lot of people say yes because I do see this out there, and we did specifically target this webinar at the higher education space. All right, so yeah, I got a high percentage of yeses here, which is what I was expecting, but I did want to make sure. So I'll go ahead and close that poll. And so what are the challenges we face with multi-role users? Well, they can spawn multiple accounts, like I talked about. Those accounts, are a lot of times unmanaged. So a lot of times it's created in an ad hoc basis. We don't have a holistic view of what users have access to in all their different accounts in those systems. It also presents a problem when different accounts are needed for the different access. How do we know which account is which? How do we know which one is a student, which one's a faculty member? And we don't have a good method of linking those with a single identity. So many times in identity management, we look at the central repository of identity management as the place where we need to basically take accounts in one system and many disparate systems and link them up to a single identity. And then granted access is not consistently removed when a user leaves a role, probably the biggest one, because users change, users become, let's say not a faculty member, they leave, they're terminated, however, but they still are a student and they still need to have that student access. And we have to ensure that when they leave, we deactivate the faculty access, but we ensure we leave the student access. And so just to walk through some of these cycles, I'm going to pick on Ellucian's banner because we see that a lot. It doesn't have to be, it could be any authoritative source. And so we're looking at that as that's what's the driving factor is for our identity in this environment. We're pulling that information in. They're a faculty member, they're a coordinator in the English department. So our composite identity, which you could almost synonymously put a identity and access management system in the middle there, has provisioned an Active Directory account. We've assigned some group memberships based upon attributes we got from that employee record in Banner, and we've assigned the attributes. Additionally, this user also gets an Azure account, Azure Active Directory, synonymous with Office 365. So faculty members are using Office 365, they get an Azure Active Directory account, and we provision and assign them a license. Now, for a student, this user also may become a student at some point. We're pulling that identity in as a separate record or some other attribute transformation, and we'll take a look at that, how we get to that data in a bit. And then we know, okay, well, that user is now a student. They need a student Active Directory account. Okay, we've configured that. We've given them the right UPN. Maybe the UPN is different for a student. Maybe it says student.edu on the end of that suffix. And then additionally, maybe Google accounts. So we're using Gmail for those students, right? Maybe we've got faculty in Office 365, and then we've got students in Google. And it could be on the inverse as well. But this is an example of how we basically can take information from that data source and then build it out into the environment. And keeping in mind that composite identity is where all of those decisions are actually made. It's where we're housing the identity information, and it's where we are basically putting our business logic or organizational logic in place in order to make these decisions about how to create accounts, when to create accounts, and what access to give those accounts. On the inverse, let's say that Terry Adams here leaves the organization as an English coordinator, still remains a student. So our identity and access management system should go out, deactivate the Active Directory account, deactivate the Office 365 account, but should leave the other two in an active state. And that brings me to probably the central theme here of this. This is all made possible by a source of authority. In the identity and access management space, sources of authority are essentially its lifeblood. That is what drives an identity and access management solution. Sources of authority can be an HR system, an ERP system. In this case, we're looking at a student information system, right, with Banner. And so some of the common questions that we ask when we're doing an engagement to kind of kick this off, we always look for what's the unique identifiers that exist in the system of authority. How can I uniquely identify every single user in that system, and is it unique across multiple systems? And then in some cases, we say we have the identity and access management system generate those unique values. And then we maybe spit those back out to the sources of authority so that they can be tracked holistically outside of the identity management system, and we're putting that in the source of authority. It's called breadcrumbing. So if you think about Hansel and Gretel and the breadcrumbs they left, we're going to ignore the end half of that story where the breadcrumbs were eaten, but those breadcrumbs would exist in those different systems of authority. And then we really have to drill down into what the transitions look like in user states in those sources of authority, right? So we're looking at onboarding, what information appears when a user is onboarded, what information appears when the user is offboarded. And then if we're looking at specifically multi-role users, we're looking at what happens when a user pops up and then gets another role. Does that present as another record? Is it going to be in a different table? How can we manipulate this data? And usually when I say manipulate, I'm talking about putting it into a view or a SQL view, or how would I call that REST or SOAP API in order to pull it in and disseminate it appropriately. The last question here, which is highly critical, is which one is precedent? And when I say which one is precedent, I'm talking about which one kind of overtakes, right? If there's a scenario where you say, okay, user gets one account, I don't care how many roles you have, depending on which role is present dictates what level of access that account has. So I have to basically say, well, faculty member is on top of student, and so on and so forth, and go down the list. And depending on what the organization's use cases are for that scenario, dictates which one would be authoritative on the precedent of that account. And that can vary between system to system. So when I go into a engagement, I typically, we'll look at those in different ways depending on the application. I don't always assume that, okay, faculty member trumps everything. If you're a faculty member, I always have to go in there with a clear head and say, okay, for this application, which one is precedent, right? So I have to think about it as a application specific and in a business use case specific mindset. And how do we solve these challenges? So discovery. We spend a lot of time on the front end of a project doing discovery. We look at the data structure that exists, usually working with system administrators, database administrators, the SIS system, specifically for EDU systems. And then we look at the processes, right? So we have to really drill down into all those processes that I listed earlier, the onboarding, the offboarding, the multi-roles. How do those need to appear for us, or how can we retrieve them? So we spend a lot of time unpacking those. Usually involves, a design document so we can follow it to the letter when we're implementing an identity and access management system. Which brings me to my next point, right? So if we've identified all these multi-role identities, how we should handle them, now we need to configure that into an identity and access management system. So we can consume and process those identities. So there's really two parts to that. There's how do I get to the data, pull it into my identity and access management system, configure that appropriately so that I can clearly see the different multi-role users as well as all of their attributes. And then I go into the identity management system and configure it for the different business logic that needs to exist: provisioning, attribute flows, deprovisioning, account disablement, all of those things that happen during identity lifecycle, which is exactly what the third point is. And then we continually adjust. So one of the common misconceptions when an organization starts or works on an identity lifecycle management or an identity governance scenario is they believe that once I'm done with the project, everything is done, and we won't need to revisit this until the platform dies in 10 years. And that's a failed way to look at it, because the identity lifecycle management of an organization is a living, breathing entity. Applications get added, applications get changed, new scenarios start to exist in the onboarding and the offboarding and into authoritative sources. And so understanding that those things are constantly changing means you need to be agile, and you need to be communicating to the different parts of the business that own different parts of the identity and access management platform. And so what you get, so once you've got all of these things identified, put into place, what do we get out of all of this? What's the value to the business? Holistic identity lifecycle management is a big one. If I can go in and say, this user has access to A, B, C, and D, and this is how they got access, and this is when they got access, at the time of an audit or the time of some investigation, or just an understanding of how your users are using or getting access to applications can be invaluable. I can't, before I was doing consulting, I was always in the doing identity management for a healthcare organization. I was always asked to do different reports at different times, and being able to present that data either as metrics to provide justification for certain other business needs, or to provide investigative reporting needs for the organization. It was invaluable to have that information in a central repository that I could report on. Also looking at reducing help desk call volume. With multiple roles, users are going to be trying to figure out why they can't get into application A, why they don't have access, because they're constantly, now they have two accounts with two different separate sets of application access. The help desk has to understand, well, I've got to provision this user to this. With an automated system, you can really reduce that help desk call volume. We can also increase security posture. And this really comes around to the deprovisioning of access when the users leave. And this is in no way tied to multi-role users. However, when you do have multi-role users, you've increased the footprint of an attack, right? I've got double the accounts. And so being able to offboard or deactivate those accounts when somebody leaves as soon as it happens within the HR system is very important. And then I already said, really, within the holistic identity management lifecycle, the better understanding of your identity footprint. Understanding the size and scope of all the identities in the organization is very helpful. Putting in an automated system, can help with that, but actually doing the investigative work, understanding all the processes and everything that needs to take place really can add to a greater understanding throughout the organization of the identity management footprint and its processes. All right. So I'm going to jump over to some of the bonus content that I talked about, and this one is from Microsoft. It's Azure. Actually, both of these will be from Microsoft. This one's called Azure AD Password Protection. This one I don't think it's gotten the love it deserves on different webinars and promotions from Microsoft, but I actually think this is a really big feature, and I think it should be looked at by a lot more organizations. Password protection from the Microsoft side is actually looking at limiting what users can use for passwords, right? So currently in a Microsoft environment with Active Directory, password policies are controlled by group policy objects. There's complexity, there's number of character limitations, there's history, but there isn't much more than that. There's also a way to do fine-grained passwords through from later versions of Active Directory. But it still doesn't actually have like a dictionary, right? So a dictionary list of passwords that users can't choose. And the reason we need these is because users know that they can do text character substitutions with @ symbols and $ and zeros and threes for ease. And that's not really fooling anybody, right? Hackers know that everybody does that. It's one of the first things that they do when they're doing brute force attacks is do character replacements. And then complexity rules lead to repeatable syntax. I was reading an article the other day where most people use the number 1 on the end of their passwords. I guarantee you some of you have probably just said, yep, I use a number 1. And then the letter E shows up in passwords, about 33% of the time. But that syntax is not only just when your initial creation, but on the iterations of passwords. So because we have a password change date every 90 days, year, whatever, the next one I do is going to have a 2 on the end, and I'm going to go on so forth and repeat those passwords. Password change rules also lead to those predictable patterns. There's audit requirements in play that force us to make users change their passwords so we can pass different regulatory compliance frameworks. And those may change as we go into the future with a password list, and I'll talk about some of the advancements in that next. But password changes are still going to exist for the here and now due to those requirements. But for Microsoft's password protection, this is the architecture of what they are offering, and this is offered with an Azure AD Premium license, so it requires Azure AD Premium, and for a long time now, on the domain controllers themselves, there has been there's always been the ability for us to create a password filter DLL. It has to be written in C++. and it basically can restrict how users, what users can use on their passwords. This has been provided by a couple of different companies, but I've rarely seen them implemented anywhere, I think, aside from a few organizations. But what Microsoft has done is they provided a way to put your password policy or your banned password list in the cloud. You go into the Azure portal and you put it in there, and then you configure proxy servers that your domain controllers will communicate to retrieve that list and then build that DLL for you. And so that when a user changes that password or decides to change their password, if the password violates the password list that you've uploaded to the cloud, they can't set it to that password. And so it's a very simple configuration. It requires some modifications to the domain controller with a piece of software that you have to install that's reaching out to the proxy service, and then the proxy service retrieves the policy and is actually requested by the DC. When the user changes their password, there is no communication being done to the cloud. So that was one of the common misconceptions that a lot of organizations had. They always ask me, what happens if I lose internet connectivity? Well, the internet connectivity is being done when the proxy service pulls down the password filter. The filter is going to be static. If you lose internet connectivity, the old password filter is still going to be used. So it's not internet dependent. It's just for that I think it does it on an hourly update cycle. So and most places are going to kind of set this and forget it. They may make modifications later, but it's not something that's going to be modified on a very continual basis. So you're not going to modify it every hour. And so what does that portal look like where we can go and upload those passwords? So ignoring the smart lockout threshold settings, because that's something else entirely, we're really focused on the custom banned password list here. So we can enforce the list, which basically means if I hit yes there, when a user goes and changes their password and it violates one of the ones on the banned password list, it'll prevent them from changing that password. I can set it to no, which is an interesting concept because I can say no, but I can specify the mode to an audit mode, meaning it's actually going to output events in the Windows event log to say, hey, this password would have violated the policy. It still allows the user to do it, but you can start to get an idea of how many of the passwords in your password list are actually being set by users when they change their password. There's another interesting item about the actual password list. Microsoft is actually doing those text replacement or text string replacements for you. So A's are also looked at as an @ symbol, E's are looked at as threes, S's are looked at as $signs. All of those common transitions between those two different string types. And then enabling the password on Windows Server Active Directory enables that diagram that I just saw. So I know I showed the diagram because most of our customers are in a hybrid environment with an on-premise Active Directory, but this also could apply to cloud-only organizations. We just don't ever deal with them because usually they're a bit smaller. But if you are one of those organizations that doesn't have an on-premise Active Directory, you would just say no here, and you would use this as it exists with your cloud accounts. All right, so my second one here is as we go into the future and we leave these passwords behind, what has Microsoft done in this space? And I'm sure you've seen Windows Hello. I know we've done webinars on Windows Hello. In that same area, Microsoft is also doing work with its Authenticator app, and basically allowing you to sign in without a password, but just a notification on the Authenticator app. And so getting rid of the password has been a big part of their drive. They've done a lot of work on the FIDO Alliance, and they are continuing to push the passwordless future to all of us. In fact, they did so on their consumer accounts before they actually released this for Azure. And if you have a Microsoft account, you can enable passwordless sign-in using the same Authenticator app that we'll be talking about here. And the reason we're getting rid of these is passwords are a weak layer of protection. Over 80% of breaches at organizations are caused by compromised passwords. As we looked at in the previous technical piece there. Passwords are reused, they're written down, and they are sometimes shared between individuals. And they are very unwittingly disclosed via phishing attacks, right? That's a very common vector, right? So if we can prevent users from having to type that in while also maintaining security, then it's a big win for the security posture of your organization. And so what Microsoft has done, and I'll do a quick demo because I like to challenge myself. I feel like a webinar without a demo that could potentially fail is worth doing. But the Authenticator app, if you haven't already downloaded it, is available on Android, iOS. I think there's still a Windows Phone version out there, but I can't remember. I'm not sure that's important. But so the two major platforms in mobile, we have Authenticator app. And when the user types in their email address and clicks next on an Office 365, Azure, or any other application that is currently federated with your Azure Active Directory, and you've enabled passwordless sign-in, they will get a notification on their Authenticator app. They will have to biometrically or through a passcode, depending on how their device's security is set up, get into that Authenticator app. So there is a gate there that kind of makes you do a who you are type of check. On my Android phone, it makes me put in my fingerprint on the back. iOS would be using Touch ID. Once the user has made it into their Authenticator app, they're presented with a list of 3 choices for the number. They have to pick the match of the number. And once they do that, they're in. If they get a false notification, they can click deny, and administrators will get a notification that, hey, I'm getting false authentication apps into my environment. And so just as before I go into the instructions, just as a quick demo, I'll reload this window here. This is going to be a very quick demo here. So I put in my email address, I click next. The Authenticator app is going to give me a notification here. Once I get that notification, I'll have to do the Touch ID here. And then I have 21 on the screen there, and I click approve, and then it will log me in. Because it's a private browser, I have this stay signed in here for cookie or authentication length of cookie sessions. And then I'm into my Azure portal. And this would work with Office 365 or, as I said, any application that's federated with Active Directory. This is ridiculously easy to set up in your organization. The most complicated part is actually getting the Authenticator app out there in your environment, but there's different ways to do that with Intune or other MDM or app pushing, MDM solutions. And it's really just done through PowerShell. I've got a short link up there. We'll also have these slides available, but from PowerShell, you're going to use the Azure AD Preview module, connecting to Azure Active Directory. You have to be a global administrator or a security administrator to run this. And then you're going to set what's known as a new Azure AD policy, which basically enables the Authenticator app sign-in policy to enabled, and that it is organizational default. Some of the caveats to this or known issues is that it's going to bypass ADFS. So if you have Active Directory federated services in your environment, it will bypass ADFS because the check is being done on the mobile phone. It doesn't invoke ADFS. And then the device itself, so the device where the Authenticator app is registered, can only have one Azure AD tenant, so only one work or school account for passwordless authentication. So one account has to be the designated one for passwordless auth. Other accounts can exist in there with either the rotating codes, but only one work or school account can be set up for passwordless authentication. I think that's it. So I clocked in at 30 minutes there. I have one more poll for us, is if you're interested in learning about more about OCG's consulting services, whether it be through anything that I've talked about here or anything related to identity and security, we'd be very happy to talk to you about any of these engagements. All right, thanks. Well, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at any of these emails, social media links. But thank you for attending today. And I hope you have a good week.